The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Henning Gloystein. Henning Gloystein is Eurasia Group's practice head for energy, climate, and natural resources, based in London. He covers geopolitical risk in energy and raw material supplies, the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, as well as green industrial trends. Now let's get into the episode with Henning. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Great to be back. Really looking forward to this.
Yes, I am as well. And John, we're fortunate to have a European guest that will be talking what's going on in Europe, which is great for our listeners.
Well, we're welcoming back Henning Gloystein, practice head of energy, climate, and resources at Eurasia Group. Welcome, Henning.
Thanks for having me again. I look forward to the conversation. It's been a while.
Since we last spoke, how has the energy supply landscape evolved in terms of coal, renewable, nuclear, and natural gas sources since our last update?
So the first thing I think I can say is the good news is there weren't any big outages. There was a price shock, but we didn't run out of energy. People didn't freeze in winter. And we've literally a couple of weeks ago come out of the second winter coping largely without Russian natural gas. So glass half full, maybe a little bit more than half full, but it has cost an arm and a leg financially and politically. It's been a very painful adjustment. And in terms of sort of fossil fuel consumption and renewables, it's similar. It's a glass half full story probably. There's been a vast renewable expansion, capacity expansion, particularly in the North Sea basin of offshore wind, but also solar power on especially residential buildings has taken off on quite a impressive scale. But of course, it's also cost impressive money. And then if you look at the natural gas and coal-fired consumption, Europe, when the emergency erupted sort of in spring, summer 2022, had to fire up all its available coal-fired power stations to just prevent shortages. A lot of that has been shut down again, or at least mothballed, so we can cope without those now. Natural gas consumption has been reduced drastically. Again, it sounds positive because, we have access to gas. We've accessed new people and new sources of gas from Norway, from the United States, in particular, those two, at huge costs, though. And these costs aren't just financial. There's been industrial shutdowns in base chemicals, in fertilizer production, pulp, and some of that will never come back. But the achievement has been quite remarkable. There is very little fear of a winter energy shortage come 2024, 2020.
We're in North America, we have such an abundance of energy supply, and quite frankly, I think we take it for granted. I know we take it for granted, by the way. And so it's always a pleasure to speak to people like yourself and John to learn how you accommodate and how you think of energy, because you think of it differently. But I'm curious, what are the latest developments regarding importing energy supply, particularly focusing, if you could, on LNG? Because I know there was a real fast pace of getting those terminals built, and I'm just curious to see what's happened since we last spoke.
Yeah, I mean, when we last spoke, Germany was physically incapable of importing LNG. There were no import terminals in Germany. Now there are 4. That's almost Chinese-style expansion. There are others across Europe. The Dutch were actually even faster. They built an additional import terminal within 4 months of the crisis starting. In the Mediterranean basin, there are a few more as well. So that's a part of this great achievement. The energy industry, and this is, I think, some credit where due. They get a lot of criticism for profiteering, for making lots of profit. And of course they have. Exxon made $50 billion net profit in 2022, energy traders as well. But we have to acknowledge how capable this industry has been in supplying energy that have become really scarce at short notice to Europe. So it's an amazing achievement. I really find that. And in the LNG space, though, the way this is seen in Europe now, we have to absolutely must see LNG and natural gas overall as a scarce commodity. There's no other way around it, because for all these achievements, the Russian gas is gone, and it's not going to come back, even if there is a surprise ceasefire next week in Ukraine. We're not going to. So part of the pipeline system is gone. Nord Stream is largely broken, and the trust, of course, has been lost. Even if there was a change in leadership in Russia, Germany can't repeat what it did in the past to just import all its gas from Russia. Neither can the Italians or the Austrians. So This is gone, and this means this market is gone for the foreseeable future, and that means that natural gas is a scarce commodity, which it didn't used to be. I mean, prices in Europe are also always higher than, well, in the recent past, always higher than in North America, but it was not seen as a because we have to consider if there was only one big event, let's say in the United States, some political or hurricane event that shuts down the LNG sector, or if Norway had a massive wave of strikes that shuts down its offshore sector for a while, then Europe could find itself in a pickle quite fast again. So this means that you have to economize on its use. So this how with every scarce commodity, you have to be a bit careful on how you consume it. And what that means for Europe is not that we're going to phase out gas entirely. There are no credible plans to do that for the next 40 years, but is to reduce its role in certain areas where you can, and that is mostly power generation. Not entirely, but we need to squeeze natural gas out of power generation so that the remaining gas that we really can't find a solution yet for, an alternative solution that's mostly in energy intensive industry, the so-called hard to abate industries, that gas is affordable so that we don't lose those industries, that deindustrialization doesn't happen. Because it's worth keeping in mind, steel, chemical making, cement making, these are unionized jobs, so they're important for politically. They're important, of course, for the families that are reliant on their income. These are industries now seen as strategically important in all the reshoring, friendshoring, greenshoring drive around the world. But also, of course, the Europeans are now, for the first time in probably since I'm a teenager, are actually spending the 2% of GDP on their defense commitments. And, if you build a lot of tanks, ammunition, and airplanes, you need steel and you need chemicals to do that. So there's a whole new argument to this. We need that gas for crucial industry. Where we don't need it, we must try and squeeze it out. And that probably involves the power generation sector, not entirely, but as much as possible. And it involves heating. We need to reduce gas boiler heatings. We need to rip out as many as we can. It's happening in the UK as well, for that matter. Britain, £7,500 direct subsidy to replace your gas boiler. So this is an absolute priority because gas is a scarce commodity, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
Just a quick follow-up. So I understand the status, what you've conveyed about conservation, efficiency, and LNG. Is there any other imported energy supply like biomass? Is hydrogen starting to be looked at as being imported as well into the European community?
So biomass is a tricky one because, first of all, the economics, I think, are tricky anyway. If your biomass is cheap as a product, and if you put it on a ship and ship it somewhere else, it becomes expensive. But there's also some political aspects in it. So biomass, if it's biofuel, in the Americas, including North America and Brazil, you see this drive to burn ethanol, drive to basically burn crop and make it into fuel. In the Americas, seen as a source for sustainable aviation fuels, of which there are strict mandates in future to use more. But in Europe, this is the concept of burning food for fuel is not seen as sustainable by definition. It's not just Europe, for that matter. The Indians don't like that either. So there's a lot of political and ideological, gravel in the way to make this a smooth product. It's one of the buzzwords of the transition. And in some areas, I'm a great hydrogen bull, and in some other areas, I think it's a pipe dream. So hydrogen will work. It's already starting to work in some areas in Europe, as where indeed steel and chemical producers are introducing at commercial scale hydrogen-based solutions as we speak. And so that'll work, but it's very specific. This is as an industrial feedstock again, and this will only work in areas where there will be great renewable power generation oversupply, not just sufficient supply, but oversupply. The North Sea Basin, with all its offshore wind coming online, is a very good example. Spain probably as well, wind and solar. Because what this means is that during days when there's a surplus of electricity, you can just switch on the electrolysis units and store it as gas. It's actually a beautiful solution for these negative power prices that are coming up all over the place now, that you use cheap or negative electricity prices to generate hydrogen, store it, transfer that cheap electricity to a later time when there's high demand. And that resolves the intermittency and provides an industrial feedstock. Brilliant. But not all areas have access to offshore wind, and not all areas are sunny. So wherever that's the case, I think this green hydrogen electrolysis unit concept will not work. big batteries, storage batteries might have to be the solution. Maybe more interconnectors to send power around the world will work. And then, of course, in hydrogen, you've got the blue hydrogen aspect. There's the concept of getting, especially from North America, natural gas turned into hydrogen through carbon capture and storage technology. Possible. The European legislators, even the most anti-blue hydrogen governments, with Germany being probably the biggest one, have come around. So the German government, under the economy and climate minister Robert Habeck, who's a Green Party member, who prior to this crisis wouldn't touch CCS and blue hydrogen. He says, like, that's an extension of fossil gas use. It's bad. They in January or February this year announced that we will legislate CCS as an option. And so if that means importing blue hydrogen from Norway or from the US or anywhere else, that's possible, as long as it is commercially viable. And this is where I personally see a problem, because I mentioned natural gas is a scarce commodity from a European point of view, so it means it's going to be expensive, and you're going to add the cost of CCS on top of that. Whereas blue hydrogen via electrolysis, it's very expensive now. But these are technologies, they're scalable, and the more you use them, the cheaper they get. This is the same trend you've seen in solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines. And I suspect the blue hydrogen will have a cost competition problem in Europe. But I mean, if I'm wrong, that'd be wonderful. And the realization is we'll need all forms of clean hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen in Europe to meet our demand forecasts in order to decarbonize those hard to abate industries.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just follow up, Dave. You're talking about biomass and imports. Of course, one of the biggest single biomass imports that we can look at in the UK is wood pellets coming into our Drax power station, which Drax, depending on the time of day, could be anywhere between 5 and 12% of the UK's electricity. And to say that is surrounded in, shall we say, questions about the sustainability of the supply and everything else might be just putting it mildly. But yeah, and it is interesting, isn't it, how when we started, you were saying it's really good to hear from somebody in Europe. But I think one of the things we always have to keep remembering is energy is a global market. And whilst it has some nuances, what happens in one place does knock on to another. But I'll get back to what my question is, and it follows on slightly from Dave's, and particularly you were talking about the new LNG facilities. But we know a lot about things that might happen in the future, but what sort of technology and engineering activities are underway currently that may enhance energy supply, make it more secure, make it more efficient?
That's a very cool question. Thanks. Because we can talk a lot about policy, and I'm a policy wonk, but a lot of these solutions are engineering solutions. And luckily, Europe is pretty good at engineering, not just the Germans. Italy has great engineers, the UK still has great engineers, the Netherlands, Spain. There are a lot of Nordics. There's a lot going on here. And if you look at the clean energy tech solutions and manufacturing hubs in Europe, they are really broadly spread out. Germany plays a big role. They play actually a leading role in virtually every clean tech sector, but that's not necessarily because they're Germany. It's also because it's the biggest country in the EU, and it sits right in the middle of it. So it's a bit of accidental luck in there as well. But if you look at the solutions power cable producers, they are all over Europe, including in Central and Eastern Europe now. Poland, Slovenia, Slovakia, Hungary, they all play a big role here. In battery manufacturing, this is not a German strength at all, actually, historically. And of course, it's originally an Asian strength, but there's manufacturing popping up across Europe. Wind turbines, there's been production problems and quality problems recently, but there's constant development. You see, for instance, the next generation of offshore wind turbines in the North Sea will have electrolysis units built into their platform. So there'll be a combined version immediately. And that is a beautiful solution. You don't need to fuss about building an electrolysis unit on land and take someone's farm away. It's in the platform in the North Sea where nobody bothers about it. It's brilliant. I mentioned cables. Cable technology has vastly improved recently. Cable technology is a European strength that no one ever talks about. Europe has the biggest integrated power market in the world by far. You can trade electricity from Finland to Portugal and Ireland to Greece live. Over the last 2 years, Ukraine has been synchronized to the EU power grid, which partly helped parts of Europe keep the lights on in the last 2 years. In the last few weeks, it helped Ukraine keep the lights on because the Russians have attacked so many power stations that they knocked out something like 7 gigawatt of gas-fired power stations in Ukraine. And the interconnector was switched to reverse, and Poland supplied electricity in Ukraine. There's a Viking Link just came online, Denmark cable to the UK. There's talk about a North African connection to the EU. The more you interconnect, the better it is, because had there not been a wide EU-wide power cable connection, a market like the euro for electricity, there would have been electricity outages in Germany, probably in the Benelux, so Belgium, Netherlands, maybe Luxembourg, and France. But they didn't, because they had live power trading. One of the reasons why you see electricity outages in, extremely wealthy areas like Australia or Texas is not because of lack of energy. I mean, Australia and Texas have every form of energy, renewable and fossil, at their doorstep. It is because they lack power connectors with their neighbors. Texas is basically an island. So is Australia, the states, New South Wales and Queensland and so forth, they're South Australia, they're badly interconnected. So this is a solution that's actually worked, but it's so geeky that no one ever talks about it. And I think the intermittency solutions to renewables will, in a few years' time, I'm actually quite convinced about this. People will shake their heads and it's like, well, why did it take us so long to actually think this is an obvious solution? Because they do work. We just need to make an effort to spend on them, and then to scale them. Lastly, and I'm not quite sure where I stand on this yet at the moment, is nuclear power. Because, of course, since the gas crisis in Europe, or the fossil fuel crisis, there's a lot of people who say, like, nuclear, we have the technology. We built, lots of countries in Europe have built nuclear reactors very successfully. Some are. So there might be a renaissance. Now, as we speak on the ground, there is no nuclear renaissance in Europe. Yes, the UK is building Hinkley Point C, probably complete Sizewell as well. But the French, they're not expanding their nuclear power. They might replace half of their existing fleet with new reactors, but that's not an expansion of nuclear power, that's halving it. Poland might build, they say 6, I say 1 to 3. So yes, some new reactors will be built, but the conventional reactors, they're too expensive. We all know the price tag they come with and the delays that they have. So I don't think that's a solution. So the one to look out for is small modular reactors. UK plays a big role in this. We'll see. They're not commercially available yet, but if that works, then I think there will be another solution. And to summarize, I think basically the technological solutions to intermittent renewables is any solution that we can get, whether it's power cables, small nukes, hydrogen electrolysis units, pumped storage, power cables, or big batteries. Some locations require different solutions, and we'll probably need all of them. But we have the know-how, and that's, I think, again, it's a good part of this.
Interesting.
So it's interesting because John brought up that energy. We all have, it is a global issue, and the things that you had mentioned, for example, in Canada, we've been talking about having tie lines from each province, which isn't done right now, which it's interesting you're saying that it's proven to be very helpful. And that's a good case study, what you're explaining and why we should be doing something on that. And then the second thing, we're on the nuclear side, certainly we're going, I think, pretty hard, more focusing on that than we have. So again, just different style people. This walks right into really policy changes and things that are going on. And Henning, you said this is kind of your area. So I'm curious to see how government policy has changed or evolved since we last spoke to you. And then what are the implications to those changes, if you could share with us that?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of policy change, and some of it was sneaking and people didn't realize it. But not in an evil way of sneaking behind people's backs, but it just happened because the emergency was so great. It really shook governments across Europe awake out of dreamy wonderland. The Germans were the most guilty of this. Their overreaction was probably the most spectacular as well. Fair enough. Sometimes you need this sort of stuff. They literally fell out of bed and knocked their head and came up, and everything was a bit different. So the good aspect here is that a lot of dogma that was present just 2 years ago is gone. I already mentioned that the Germans, for instance, used to shake their head furiously when they heard carbon capture and storage and say, no, we don't want this. It's not a green solution. They've resolved that. They say, okay, yes, we'll need this. The regulatory process for approving new energy projects, especially in the offshore wind field, have been accelerated in most countries to just allow this to expand. Very good example is in the offshore spending in the EU was 400 million euros. And then by now it is 30-40 billion euros a year. So, and that is because the regulatory environment has been changed. The most important aspect here was the EU power market reform or energy market reform, which was really crucial, because what was keeping investors back all of last year was there was always this talk about there will be a wholesale energy market reform in Europe. And once that is passed, everything will be better. That's a wonderful statement to make. But if you as an investor or project developer don't know how the energy market of 2025 will work, you're not going to invest. I mean, there's no way, because you don't know how high power prices will be, how volatile they'll be. You just don't know anything. And then, of course, the EU is the EU, so it has 27 member states, and they all have to approve everything, and things take forever. They approved it in the second half of last year, and it is going through now, ahead of EU parliamentary elections, which are taking place in June this year, which is very important, because had they not managed to approve that in late 2023, all the paperwork, literally the admin effort to box it through, would have not been able to be completed before EU Parliament dissolves, and then there's elections, and then there's summer recess, and then there will be a shift to the conservative towards the right wing, and then the new Parliament comes in and they want to review everything, and then they would have put everything on hold until at least next year. And then we wouldn't have had this investment push, capacity building push that we have seen, because they did manage. And the moment they managed, money was unleashed. And you can see that in power price and power purchase agreements being signed, contracts for difference being signed, capacity building. So that is something that's happened. And these reforms were, I don't know, 2/3 good. I mean, they're political reforms and it's European Union, so you always need a compromise. So it's never the perfect outcome, but it's by and large, you are incentivized to invest into facilities that will give you a guaranteed return on investment because of a contract for difference. And so yes, but it's still a clumsy process. You have to apply for the tender, and then you might not win it, and your most evil competitor might win it instead of you, and that's really annoying. And you might have to do it in 4 different languages, but it's worked. I think the fear is, and a little bit is, and a colleague of mine called Amund Vik, who was a former state secretary at the Norwegian Energy Ministry, said that earlier today to clients, is like, what you need to worry is what politicians don't do. And that is a European fear, because there's such a long to-do list. They all act according to their national interest, mostly the Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans, the Spanish, whatever, of course, because that's who elects them and that's their priority. But what you need is more interaction and collaboration, which has existed, but it's not quite good enough. And they're probably not doing enough. I'm a little bit hopeful. So there's this thing called the Antwerp Declaration. It was launched on 20th of February in Antwerp, obviously, and by about 100 companies and a handful of politicians. If you go to their webpage now, it's over 1,000 companies and hundreds of politicians. Because what has happened is it's this famous Venn diagram overlap between progressive politicians or lefties and conservative politicians or righties. They have found something they can agree on, which is amazing. They can say, so the progressives, they can say decarbonization and saving unionized jobs is really important. Okay. And so the conservative ones come up around the corner and say, we didn't like that in the past, but if this is reshoring of secure industries, and we can form a industrial base for our defense industry, then we can do this. And lo and behold, it's gaining a lot of momentum. So I am moderately hopeful that the incoming European Parliament in the second half of this year will have a push to actually do more here. But whether they'll manage, I don't know for sure. And there's a high risk of, again, sort of that they don't do quite a few things because it's just too complicated rather than do them. But when they've done things recently, a lot of dogma and sort of previously stuck ideas have been thrown out the window just by necessity.
Thank you for that. I like the next question, which is mine, because I think, I can say, and I will say, as fellow Europeans, my question is, what lessons can North America learn governments, North American governments and companies, learn from what we've done in Europe in terms of policy, energy management? What do we think we can teach North America?
Ah, wow. Okay. So I think Europe can learn a little bit from North America as well. The IRA kind of
Yep.
worked and it scared the heebie-jeebies out of most Europeans, but we'll see how that develops. This Antwerp Declaration actually tries to address that a little bit. But okay, let's turn around. I mean, so North America is in some ways, I think this gets overlooked a lot, is there's this blessed relationship between Canada and the United States. I mean, okay, of course, the US is the biggest oil and gas producer in the world now, but that wasn't always the case. And this relationship that the United States is the world's biggest economy, security machine, creative market, next to this vast resource base, speaks mostly the same language. And despite bickering, they're really close allies. That is such a stable energy relationship. The only other one I can think of is Norway and the EU, but the size and difference is just not quite the same. And of course, the Europeans, and especially the Germans, they tried to replicate it with Russia, but that famously didn't work that well. So, okay, there's nothing to learn here in that sense. We just have to live with that in Europe, that we don't have that sort of relationship. But it can lead to complacency. I know from quite a lot of, especially on the industrial side, investors who go to the United States and think everything's going to be better and bigger. And then they look at some of the facilities and they say, like, this is 1970s technology. The energy efficiency here is appalling, especially in the energy intensive industries, actually, because when gas is so cheap, you really can squeeze the profit. You can have an ancient asset. It's just going to run down the mill. It's going to make a lot of money. And that will not work forever. Not necessarily because energy becomes more expensive in the US, but eventually in Europe they will focus on the stuff they can really do well. And the energy efficiency gains of the last 2 years by big companies have been pretty mesmerizing. That they say, well, actually in future we can operate competitively, semi-competitively at cost levels as we're seeing right now, sort of April 2024, or as we saw in sort of mid 2021, which is twice the price as Americans will pay, and they can still roughly compete. What if suddenly European energy prices get cheaper because of all that overcapacity that's going to be built? Now, if on top of that you look at the skilled labor market, now Europe has its own demographic problems, but in terms of actually skilled manufactured labor, Europe is in a better position because it has better unions. I mean, this sounds like a lefty thing, but it's like long-term employment strategies that still favors labor jobs that aren't in the biggest cities, that have decent jobs and decent benefits. That sort of attracts long-term labor, and the US doesn't quite have this. Canada has it in some ways, I believe, but it's so in those areas of energy efficiency and how you treat your skilled labor force, I think North America has some aspects it could learn from Europe. And I think you can see that in some areas, because despite all the the massive attraction that the IRA is and the problems that Europe has had, yes, there has been a recession, but it's been pretty mild. And we still make steel and chemicals in Europe, and there is a production shift to value-added products that has been pretty remarkable. And the last, I think, reminder this has been, and you hear this a lot, especially from the fossil fuel industries, like, oh, if companies don't have access to cheap energy, so it'll all deindustrialize. If it becomes prohibitively expensive, yes, like we saw in 2022. But by and large, the correlation between high energy prices and deindustrialization, or low industrialization and industrialization, doesn't quite stack up, because otherwise all this stuff would be made in Louisiana, Texas, and the Middle East, and not in Japan, South Korea, or Switzerland, where you have to add value. So I think there's a little bit of, aspect to sort of energy efficiency, how you treat skilled labor, in order to attract innovation and to make good products that North America could probably learn from Europe. But at the moment, I think actually Europe isn't in a good position to tell people exactly what how things should be done, apart from maybe crisis management. That worked pretty well.
Thanks for a great episode, Henning. To end this off, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I will start. I mean, the last 2 years have shown really drastically what can be done if you put an effort behind it, financially, politically, societally. If people get their act together and say, like, and we need to change this and we need to do it now, all the naysayers who say this is impossible have been proven wrong, and we can change a lot if we really want to. And we should probably sometimes stop and say, like, okay, be nice to change things before someone puts a gun in your face. Just for forward thinking. But we can change a lot if we really want to.
Thanks for that. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think I've got two.
Oh,
But one of them is the comment that Russian gas has gone. I think, we've probably forgotten that. We're doing without it in Europe, but I think it's an important thing to realise it is gone. There is a major change in the landscape. And then I think the other one, and it ties in ever so lightly with that, but what Henning was talking about in the power of interconnections. And interestingly, that actually I think that gets interesting, because the problem that we've had about Russian gas is we didn't get on with neighbours who we had an interconnection with for gas. And I think that's one of the issues with interconnections, is you want to interconnect with a neighbour that you're comfortable with. But yeah, it's a big takeaway, I think, that what interconnections can do about intermittency. I think that's a very, very important point.
thanks for that, John. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think a couple of lessons. I think one, and this has been repeated by Henning, by the way, both podcasts, is that actually companies, for the most, can continue and do well and compete worldwide when they put their mind to it and don't say because energy pricing's higher, they can't compete. Like we hear that all the time in North America. Oh, we can't compete now. That's just strictly bull. And you guys have proven that is kind of bull. The second thing that I thought, which really was makes me hopeful, is I actually think our politicians and maybe business leaders here they don't move quick enough. And you've proven, Henning, in the discussion that you had, that, I mean, you did have a gun to your head, so you had to do it. I actually think we in society, in the world, have a gun to our head. It's called climate change, and we do have to move quickly. And you've proven it can be done. So I actually think, like, for people to say, oh, it's not possible. No, it is possible. And the European community has actually proven for that to occur. Maybe not because of climate change, but because something changed in their environment that made them change. So I found it very inspiring, this discussion.
Well, Dave, John, Henning, thanks for a great episode.
Interesting as always.
Thanks, everyone.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.